I never imagined that a simple dinner could turn into a battlefield. Across the dimly lit table at Husk, Evander looked at me with an intensity I had only seen a few times before, and it wasn't love that shone in his eyes. I need full access to your $2.8 million inheritance, or this marriage is over, he said, his voice calm, almost chilling. I froze mid-bite, the fork trembling slightly in my hand. The carefully prepared duck in front of me suddenly seemed tasteless, the candlelight flickering across his face, casting shadows that made him look like a stranger. My mind raced. 2 years of marriage, shared dreams, and late-night laughter had led to this moment. He wasn't asking, he was demanding. And it wasn't about us, it was about money. The weight of his words pressed down on me. My inheritance, carefully safeguarded in a trust set up by my grandfather, was never meant to be touched lightly. It was protection, foresight, and legacy all in one. And now Evander, the man I had trusted with my heart, was telling me he wouldn't stay married unless he could control it. I set down my fork slowly, feeling the polished wood beneath my fingers, and reached for my phone, calm, deliberate. He noticed, and panic flickered across his face, just for a moment. "Wait, this isn't what I meant," he said, his voice faltering, but I had heard him loud and clear. 2 years of building a life together, of shared plans and whispered promises, boiled down to one thing, a test of priorities. I realized, with a sinking clarity, that Evander had married me, or at least he thought he had married my wealth, not me. The ambient sounds of Husk faded, the city lights outside blurring into a backdrop for this private storm. My heart pounded, my breath hitched, and for the first time I truly saw the man across from me, not just as my husband, but as a mirror reflecting what our marriage had become. And in that moment I knew. My life as I knew it was about to change forever. I could crumble under the weight of betrayal, or I could stand, shielded by the legacy that my grandfather had entrusted me to protect. Either way, nothing would ever be the same. I'm 32 now, a luxury real estate agent in Charleston, navigating a world of grand estates, champagne receptions, and meticulously manicured gardens. I grew up in a middle-class family, where hard work and ambition were the keys to survival. From an early age, I learned to balance determination with grace, a lesson that would later shape every choice I made, including the one that led me to Evander. Evander was 36 when we met, an investment advisor with a sharp mind and a quiet confidence that made him impossible to ignore. We met at a charity gala, one of those elegant, candlelit affairs where the air smells faintly of roses and ambition. I was showing a listing to a prospective client, navigating polite conversations about art collections and wine vintages, when he approached, and suddenly, the room seemed to shrink around us. There was an immediacy to his presence, a calm authority that made me both nervous and intrigued. We started dating 8 months later. The initial months were intoxicating. Late dinners, long drives along the Charleston Harbor, quiet nights discussing everything from politics to family histories. I thought I had found someone who understood both my mind and my ambitions, someone who saw me for more than just my career or charm. For the first time, I felt truly aligned with a partner, sharing dreams as though we were building a life on the same blueprint. Our engagement felt like the natural next step. Evander proposed during a weekend getaway to Magnolia Plantation under the Spanish moss and golden sunlight. I said yes, convinced I was stepping into a life of love and partnership. At the time, the details about his inheritance were clear to me. He had explained the irrevocable trust, the annual distributions, and the protection his grandfather had set up. I had been impressed, even inspired, by the foresight and prudence he inherited. The structure seemed fair, responsible, and perfectly reasonable. I thought I understood what it meant to be a partner. In the early months of our marriage, everything seemed perfect. I loved him, and I thought he loved me. But there were subtle signs, tiny cracks in the facade that I, eager and trusting, chose to overlook. Comments about money, small, almost casual, started to surface. Casual mentions of friends whose spouses had full access to family wealth, or stories of couples who traveled extensively because they pooled resources. I smiled politely, dismissed the unease it stirred in my chest. After all, Evander had always been responsible, measured, and protective of his family's legacy. My relationship with his family was courteous but tense. Evander's parents were polite, almost excessively so, hovering with subtle judgment that I tried to ignore. Their admiration for my career was evident, yet there was an undercurrent of expectation, of loyalty, of unwavering alignment with their son's world. I kept my distance, maintaining a careful balance, trying to be the perfect daughter-in-law without losing myself. And then there were my own moments of quiet reflection, wondering if I could truly fit into a life that was already so meticulously structured, if I could measure up not just as a wife, but as a guardian of a legacy I had no right to. I brushed away the doubts, convincing myself that love could bridge any gap, that commitment could withstand subtle tension. At that time, I believed wholeheartedly that I had chosen a partner who shared my values, someone whose respect for the past was as profound as his vision for the future. But as the months passed, the small hints of discontent began to grow louder, clearer. I didn't realize it then, but those early warnings, the sideways glances at my spending, the occasional sighs about our financial potential, the gentle prodding about access to his inheritance, were the seeds of a storm I would one day have to face head-on. For now, though, life felt comfortable, secure, even luxurious, and I told myself that love, above all, would guide us through anything. At first, the tension was subtle, almost imperceptible, a sigh here, a pointed comment there. Evander had always been careful with his words, deliberate and measured, but gradually I began noticing a change. It started with casual remarks about what we could do if I had full access to the inheritance. He'd say it lightly at first, jokingly, during dinners or walks along the harbor. I laughed it off, reassuring him that the distributions were generous enough, that the trust existed for a reason. Yet there was a flicker in his eyes, a restless curiosity that unsettled me more than I admitted. Then came the small comparisons to other couples he knew, friends or clients whose wives had equal access, whose financial partnerships were complete. I tried to shrug it off, but the undertone gnawed at me. It wasn't just curiosity, it was dissatisfaction. He began pressing, not aggressively, but persistently, questioning why we couldn't do more, why we couldn't leverage the inheritance in ways I hadn't considered. I felt a quiet pressure building, not just from him, but from his family. His mother, always polished, always polite, would drop subtle comments when I visited. You know, in our family, wives are trusted with everything, or, it's important to share responsibilities fully. There was admiration in her voice, yes, but also an expectation, a reminder that my role wasn't just to love Evander, but to integrate seamlessly into a world where wealth and legacy mattered as much as partnership. Evander's father was quieter, but no less observant. I sensed his scrutiny in the way he would tilt his head during conversations about my work, my finances, even my lifestyle choices. Everything I did seemed under review, measured against invisible standards. I began questioning myself in private moments. Was I doing enough? Was I demonstrating the partnership they expected? Meanwhile, Evander's own behavior grew more ambiguous. He started bringing up hypothetical scenarios about investments, luxury purchases, and travel plans that we could enjoy together if we had unrestricted access to the trust. His tone remained gentle, almost flirtatious, but the message was clear. Our life as it was wasn't enough. I felt a mix of anxiety and indignation. I had married him, yes, but I hadn't married his inheritance. At night, I would lie awake, replaying conversations in my mind, searching for signs I had missed, wondering if I was overreacting or simply too naive. I questioned my own judgment. Had I ignored warning signs during our courtship? Had I been blind to subtle cues from his family? And then came the whispers from friends, offhand remarks about other women in Charleston who had successfully navigated financial partnerships through marriage. They were meant to be casual, yet each comment felt like a mirror, reflecting the widening gap between expectation and reality. I found myself growing defensive, irritated at their assumptions, yet secretly unsettled by the possibility that maybe I hadn't fully understood what being a partner meant in Evander's world. Little by little, a heaviness settled into our home. Conversations that used to be effortless now carried unspoken tension. I noticed my pulse quicken when he mentioned future investments or large purchases. I felt my heart tighten at polite comments from his family, as if every word held judgment. The partnership I had envisioned seemed increasingly conditional, tied not to love or mutual respect, but to access, control, and entitlement. I tried to confront my feelings, to separate reality from anxiety, but each time I found myself circling back to the same uncomfortable truth. A storm was quietly forming, one that neither of us could fully acknowledge yet, but whose first cracks were already visible in the polished veneer of our life together. It was a Friday evening, and the air in Charleston carried that warm, salty tang that always made the city feel alive. Evander had suggested dinner at Husk, one of those places where the ceilings are high, the chandeliers grand, and the air is thick with the mingling scents of truffle, smoke, and roasted meats. I had anticipated a normal evening, perhaps some soft laughter, maybe a conversation about a new property I was listing. I was completely unprepared for the conversation that would redefine our marriage. We sat across from each other at the table, candlelight reflecting in his sharp eyes. His hands were folded neatly in front of him, the posture so calm and collected that it made the words that followed even more chilling. "I've been thinking about our marriage," he began, his voice almost serene, but I could feel the undercurrent of something heavier, something resolute. My stomach tightened. "I need you to give me full access to your inheritance, the trust, everything," he said, the words landing like cold stones. I blinked, unsure if I had heard him correctly. The fork in my hand felt suddenly heavy, and I gripped it tighter. "Excuse me?" I managed, trying to keep my voice steady, my pulse hammering in my temples. Evander's gaze never wavered. "Full access, as your partner and your wife," he clarified, the calmness in his tone masking the ultimatum underneath. My mind raced. I had known his inheritance was protected in an irrevocable trust, carefully structured by his grandfather. I knew the principle was untouchable, the distributions controlled. I had never imagined this day would come, where the very foundation of our financial life would be weaponized in our marriage. We've discussed this," I said, attempting to inject reason into the conversation. "The trust was set up specifically to prevent access to the principal. It's not just a matter of choice. It's legally protected." I could feel my voice shaking slightly, betraying the storm of emotions building inside me. Disbelief, hurt, frustration. Evander leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. "Then find a way. I'm not asking for everything, just equal partnership in our financial decisions. If you can't or won't, then I don't think this marriage is working." Time seemed to slow. The clatter of cutlery and soft murmur of other diners faded into background noise. I stared at him, trying to reconcile the man I married with the man sitting across from me, casually willing to dissolve our bond over money I couldn't legally grant him. My chest tightened. My hands shook, not with anger yet, but with a surge of clarity. This wasn't negotiation. This was a test of my boundaries, my principles, my understanding of love itself. I took a deep breath, letting the scent of the restaurant, smoke, wine, truffle, ground me. "Let me make sure I understand," I said, my voice measured, calm, despite the storm inside. "You are saying you want to end our marriage unless I restructure a legally bulletproof trust to give you access to my family's inheritance?" "Yes," he said simply, as if the simplicity of the answer made it reasonable. "I need a partner who treats me as an equal. I can't be married to someone who keeps me locked out of major decisions." I could feel my pulse in my throat, the blood rushing through my ears. The irony was sharp and bitter. I had married a man who I thought valued partnership, love, and shared dreams, only to realize that his definition of equal was conditional, bound to assets he had no right to demand. Calmly, I reached for my phone and opened my contacts. "What are you doing?" he asked, a flicker of unease crossing his composed expression. "Calling my lawyer," I said, my voice firm. "If you want a divorce, let's do it properly." For the first time that evening, I saw panic in his eyes. He leaned forward, a hand brushing against mine, almost pleading. "Evander, I didn't mean it like that right now. I meant maybe we could work together." "No," I said, my tone unwavering. "You were very clear. Access to the inheritance, or divorce. Since I cannot grant you access, divorce it is." I hit call, bringing my attorney directly into the storm that had engulfed our marriage in one sentence. As the phone rang, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Sorrow for what our marriage could have been. clarity in my resolve, and a deep, simmering understanding that Evander had revealed his true priorities in that single, devastating ultimatum. Love, it seemed, had no place here. Only control, only entitlement, only the illusion of partnership when it suited him. That night, amidst the warm glow of husk and the soft hum of the city outside, I realized with unflinching certainty nothing would ever be the same, and for the first time I truly understood the meaning of standing firm, not just for love, but for the legacy and principles I would never compromise. After leaving Husk, the city lights blurred into streaks as I drove home, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. My mind was a cyclone of thoughts, replaying every word Evander had said, every subtle look that now seemed loaded with intent. The calm voice, the measured tone, it had all been a mask that had hidden an ultimatum that shattered the trust I thought we shared. I parked in the driveway, the warm glow of our Charleston home doing nothing to soothe the chill creeping up my spine. I sat in the car for several minutes, trying to slow my racing heart, to separate the shock from the anger. It wasn't just that he had asked for access to my inheritance. It was that he had framed it as a measure of partnership, as if love could be weighed against a trust fund. The realization stung sharply. I hadn't married a partner in the full sense. I had married someone who measured love in dollars and control. Sitting there, I felt the familiar ache of self-doubt creep in. Had I missed the signs? I replayed every dinner conversation, every discussion about investments, every polite suggestion about what we could do together. I questioned whether I had been naive, too trusting, or too eager to see the best in him. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had not misread him. Evander had been deliberate, careful, patient, waiting until he thought the moment was right to reveal his priorities. I finally got out of the car, my heels clicking sharply on the polished hardwood as I entered our home. Evander was already inside, leaning casually against the kitchen counter as if nothing had happened, as if our entire evening hadn't just pivoted on the edge of an ultimatum. I called Sarin, I said, my voice steady, despite the storm inside. My lawyer's name was always my anchor in moments like these, a reminder that I had protection, that I had foresight, just like my grandfather had intended. If you want this divorce, we'll do it properly. Evander's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of something like regret, or maybe panic, crossing his face. I didn't mean right now, he said, his voice softening, but the edge was still there, the expectation still unspoken. I shook my head slowly, the motion deliberate. You were very clear tonight. Full access to my inheritance, or this marriage ends. I cannot, and will not, grant you access to what isn't yours to take. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing briefly before stopping near the living room couch. You're making this about money, he said, his voice rising slightly. It's not. I just want to be treated as your partner, equal. Why is that so hard to understand? I felt the sting of tears, but I refused to let them fall. Instead, I let my eyes meet his, steady, unwavering. I understand perfectly. The problem is, your definition of equality is conditional on my family's wealth. That isn't partnership, Evander. That's leverage. There was a tense pause. The air between us was thick, almost tangible, charged with the collision of love, betrayal, and principle. I felt my chest tighten, my heartbeat pounding like a drum in the silence. Every instinct told me to flee, to escape the suffocating pressure of a man who had revealed his true priorities so starkly. I thought you'd understand, he said finally, softer now, almost pleading. I understand, I replied, my voice calm but resolute. I understand exactly who you are, and I understand that someone who would end a marriage over money they cannot legally access isn't the partner I thought I had. Evander sank onto the couch, the fight draining from him, replaced by a heavy quiet. I could see the realization dawning, the awareness that his plan to force compliance had failed. And yet for all the shock, the betrayal, and the pain, I felt something unexpected rising within me. Clarity, a sense of inner power. For the first time that night, I allowed myself to breathe, to feel the full weight of what had happened and the strength I had to face it. I wasn't naive, I wasn't powerless. I had foresight, protection, and the courage to stand for what was mine. Not just the inheritance, but my dignity, my principles, and my life. And in that moment, I knew something crucial. Whatever happened next, I would not crumble. Evander could threaten, plead, even beg, but I would remain unshaken, anchored by the knowledge that some things, trust, legacy, self-respect, are not negotiable. The days after Husk felt like walking through a storm that refused to pass. Every interaction with Evander was heavy with unspoken tension. He tried at first to soften the edges, small gestures, polite words, subtle attempts at compromise, but I could see through them. He wasn't negotiating anymore. He was testing boundaries, probing for weakness, and I had none to give. Then came his family. Evander's parents, once polite, distant observers, became active participants in the pressure. Lunches at their estate, once cordial, now carried an underlying scrutiny. His mother would casually mention friends whose wives were fully trusted with family assets, a seemingly innocent comment that cut deeper than she intended. "You've worked so hard building your career," she said one afternoon, "but imagine what you could do together if you were entrusted with the full picture." The words felt like a taunt, a reminder that in their eyes, I was still an outsider, someone to be tested. Evander's father, more subtle but equally persuasive, would bring up hypothetical scenarios, investments, charity contributions, luxurious vacations, all framed in terms of what we could accomplish if the trust were accessible. Each suggestion, though polite, was a reminder that in their view, my inability to grant access was a flaw, a failure of partnership. I remained calm, polite, measured, but inside the pressure was suffocating. Evander's friends began to weigh in too. Casual conversations at events, dinner parties, even coffee meetings were subtly interrogations. Questions about finances, inheritance rights, and trust structures came veiled as curiosity, but carried unmistakable judgment. I could feel the walls closing in, the social landscape shifting into a hostile arena. Friends who had once been supportive were now echoing the narrative that I was obstructing, holding back, not playing my part. Meanwhile, Evander intensified his own efforts. He would mention investment opportunities we could seize together, always circling back to the "if only the trust were accessible" line. Each mention was a calculated poke, designed to wear me down, to instill doubt in my commitment, my judgment, even my love. But instead of weakening me, it crystallized my resolve. I began meticulously documenting every conversation, every interaction, every subtle attempt at manipulation. And then came the discoveries that made my resolve concrete. I found records of his research into trusts, searches on spousal rights to inherited wealth, and inquiries into legal loopholes. He had been quietly exploring options, quietly preparing for a confrontation he must have imagined for months. The evidence was irrefutable, and the realization stung sharply. This wasn't a sudden desire for partnership. It was a deliberate, strategic push to gain access to something that was never his. The atmosphere at home became unbearable. Every dinner, every discussion about future plans carried the weight of this looming battle. I could feel my pulse quicken whenever he mentioned money, my stomach tighten at each reference to joint projects, and a slow burn of anger and disappointment growing within me. The man I had loved, for his intelligence, his foresight, his calm strength, had shown me a different side, one where entitlement and ambition overshadowed affection and partnership. Family gatherings became tense, with polite smiles masking silent judgments. Evander's parents, friends, and colleagues seemed to align subtly against me, questioning my intentions, scrutinizing my actions, and implying that I was an obstacle to the greater good of partnership. I was the outsider once more, the one whose refusal to bend principles was now framed as unreasonable, selfish, even dangerous. Through it all, I learned something profound about power and boundaries. I realized that Evander's campaign wasn't personal, it was strategic. And my role wasn't to fight blindly, but to maintain clarity, to protect myself, and to stand firm on legal and moral grounds. I started consulting my attorney daily, cross-referencing the trust documents, and preparing for every possible scenario. I was no longer a passive participant. I was fully awake, fully aware, and fully prepared. Each escalation, each intrusion, each veiled threat or probing question strengthened my understanding of who I was and who I would allow myself to be. The more the pressure mounted, the more I saw the truth. This marriage, the partnership Evander had promised, was conditional on access to wealth he had no legal claim to. And in that realization, I found a quiet, unshakable strength that would carry me through the coming storm. By the time I confronted him again, I was not the woman who had walked into Husk 2 weeks earlier. I was composed, deliberate, unyielding. Every conversation, every meeting, every confrontation was now guided by clear principles, legal understanding, and the knowledge that no amount of social pressure could force me to betray my values. Evander and his allies could escalate as much as they wanted, but I was anchored, immovable, prepared to defend not just myself, but the integrity of the trust and the legacy it represented. The nights became the hardest. Charleston's warm air, once comforting, now pressed against my skin like an invisible weight. I would lie awake in our bedroom, the moonlight spilling across the hardwood floors, illuminating the silence that had settled like dust in every corner of our home. Evander was there, in body if not in spirit, and yet I felt more alone than I had ever been. I replayed the ultimatum over and over in my mind. Full access to your inheritance, or this marriage is over. The words had carved a deep groove in my consciousness, and every memory of our shared laughter, whispered dreams, and quiet moments of connection now felt tainted, reframed through the lens of betrayal. I couldn't escape the thought. The man I had loved, trusted, built a life with, had measured our relationship against money he had no right to demand. The isolation grew. Friends who had once been allies seemed hesitant to take sides, cautious about alienating Evander or his influential family. Their silence was deafening. Even the city, vibrant and alive during the day, felt empty at night, the streets echoing my own sense of abandonment. I found myself wandering through the rooms of our house, touching the walls, the furniture, as if seeking some tangible connection to the life I thought I had, some anchor in a world that now felt unmoored. And yet, amidst the heartbreak, a gnawing self-doubt took root. Had I been too naive, too trusting, too blind? I questioned every decision, every gesture, every word I had exchanged with him. Perhaps I had ignored signs, overlooked subtle cues from his family, dismissed the flickers of entitlement I now saw so clearly. My mind became a labyrinth of what-ifs and if-onlys, spiraling deeper with each sleepless hour. I remember one particular night, sitting alone in the guest room he had claimed as his temporary workspace, staring at the framed photographs of our wedding. The smiles, frozen in time, felt like cruel reminders. I traced the curves of my own lips in the pictures, wondering if I had ever truly seen the man behind the smile. The realization that I had married not the person, but the idea of a man, entangled with wealth, influence, and expectation, hit me with full force. Evander's silence in those moments was suffocating. He was near, yet unreachable, a constant presence that amplified my loneliness. I began questioning the foundation of everything I believed in: love, trust, partnership. I could almost hear the whispered judgments of his friends, his family, and even my own insecurities echoing through the empty halls. You are not enough. You cannot satisfy him. You are failing. Tears came unbidden, hot and bitter, running down my cheeks as I curled into myself on the couch. The vulnerability, the raw ache of betrayal was all-consuming. I felt stripped bare, exposed not just to Evander, but to the entire world. The home we had built together now felt like a gilded cage, each luxurious detail a reminder of the constraints imposed upon me, the expectations I could never meet. And yet, beneath the despair, a faint ember of clarity glimmered. The storm of emotions, though overwhelming, was sharpening my perception. I began to see, with painful precision, the outlines of the manipulation, the calculated nature of his demands, and the unswerving commitment of his family to reinforce it. I understood that my isolation, my despair, was not a reflection of weakness, but of the gravity of the challenge I faced. By the time the first light of dawn seeped through the blinds, painting the room in soft gold, I made a silent vow to myself. I would not allow this betrayal to define me. I would not surrender to despair. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with confrontation and resistance, But I knew this. I had the right, the knowledge, and the strength to protect what mattered most: myself, my dignity, and the legacy entrusted to me. It was the lowest point I had ever known, the moment where everything seemed lost. Yet, paradoxically, it was also the moment where I first felt the stirrings of empowerment. Because only at rock bottom could I see the contours of the battle ahead with unflinching clarity and steel myself for the fight to come. Morning light streamed through the large windows of our Charleston home, brushing against the polished floors and casting long shadows across the living room. I sat at the edge of the sofa, laptop open, stacks of documents and notes spread around me like a battlefield. The past weeks of pressure, manipulation, and veiled threats had forced me into meticulous preparation, and now it was time to act, not out of revenge, but out of self-preservation and clarity. I started reviewing the trust documents again. Every page, every clause, every legal annotation. Sarin had walked me through the structure with precision, but now, with a focused mind and a personal stake sharper than ever, I began to see even more nuances. The irrevocable trust wasn't just bulletproof, it was practically impenetrable. Evander's demands, once an abstract threat, now appeared as audacious as they were futile. Then came the discovery that crystallized everything. While sorting through some emails he had accidentally left open on our shared computer, I found a string of correspondence with his friends and a financial consultant. Each message detailed strategies, loopholes, and hypothetical plans to pressure me into restructuring the trust. The language was deliberate, cold, calculating. This wasn't about partnership, it was about access, control, and entitlement. I felt a mix of anger and validation. Anger, because the man I had loved had orchestrated this campaign behind my back, and validation, because every instinct I had trusted, every quiet concern I had felt, had been correct. The evidence was irrefutable, and in that moment I realized that my despair over the past week had not been weakness. It had been clarity forming under pressure. A phone call from my lawyer, Sarin, confirmed the final pieces. Evander's lawyer will have no ground, he said calmly. The trust predates your marriage by 8 years. All provisions are airtight. Any attempt to claim principal would be a legal non-starter, and South Carolina law is very clear. You are completely protected. Hearing his words, a strange calm settled over me. The storm of fear, doubt, and isolation that had consumed me in the dark nights of the past weeks began to dissipate. I felt a renewed sense of self, an understanding that my worth was not defined by someone else's greed or entitlement. I was not the problem. The problem had been clear all along. It was time for a decisive confrontation, one that would not be emotional and reactive, but measured, precise, and undeniable. Evander would see, in black and white, the reality of his demands and the futility of his threats. I rehearsed the conversation in my mind, imagining each question, each objection, and each response I could offer calmly, firmly, and confidently. Later that day, I found him in the library, casually flipping through a book as if nothing had happened. "Evander," I began, my voice steady, "we need to talk about the trust and this marriage." He looked up, a flicker of anticipation crossing his face, likely expecting hesitation or concession. He was about to be disappointed. "I've reviewed everything, with Sarin's help," I continued, laying out the documents before him. "Your claims have no legal standing. The trust was irrevocable before we married. The principal cannot be accessed without dissolving it, which would trigger massive tax consequences. Any attempt to claim it would fail in court. Do you understand?" He opened his mouth, then closed it, stunned by the clarity and precision in my tone. For the first time in our marriage, he was silent. His carefully constructed narrative, the subtle pressure, the manipulations, all crumbled under the weight of undeniable truth. I paused, letting the silence emphasize my words. "Evander, I cannot and will not compromise my integrity or the legacy entrusted to me. I will not allow you to redefine partnership as access to what is not yours. I am done negotiating on terms that are fundamentally unfair and impossible." He looked at me, searching for a crack, a flicker of doubt, but there was none. I had transformed from the woman who had sat in husk, blindsided and shocked, to a woman anchored by certainty, principle, and self-worth. The shift was palpable, and in that room, I could feel the power dynamic invert. subtle yet undeniable. Finally, I said softly but firmly, "You can choose to stay in this marriage or leave, but you will not dictate the terms through threats or manipulation. The choice is yours, Evander, and I will not be threatened again." For the first time, he looked small, not because of me, but because the truth had revealed the boundaries he could not cross. And I, standing firm in the clarity of my convictions, finally felt free. The days that followed were surreal. Evander, once confident and calculating, seemed smaller, diminished under the weight of the truth he had ignored for too long. Word spread quietly but swiftly among his circle, family, friends, colleagues, that the marriage's foundation had been tested and had held firm on principle, not coercion. Where he had hoped for compliance, he found resistance. Where he had expected deference, he met clarity and resolve. His parents, who had subtly reinforced his sense of entitlement, began to distance themselves. The polite probing, the veiled suggestions, and the subtle nudges toward the inheritance, all of it backfired. They saw, almost too late, that their influence had failed and that their son's pursuit of leverage over me was both futile and transparent. Their social gatherings became noticeably colder, polite exchanges replaced by a cautious formality. Invitations dwindled. The unspoken alignment they had tried to enforce crumbled like brittle parchment. Evander's friends fared no better. Those who had engaged in the quiet campaign to pressure me into acquiescence realized they had backed the wrong horse. Casual commentary turned into awkward silences when I attended industry events or mutual social gatherings. The whispered judgments, once intended to isolate me, now reflected on them. A subtle, almost karmic shift occurred. People started seeing who had been manipulative and whose loyalty had been misplaced. At home, the dynamic was irreversibly altered. Evander, stripped of the leverage he had assumed he held, retreated into frustration and disbelief. Our shared spaces, once filled with laughter and easy conversation, now resonated with a tense quiet. Yet in this quiet, I discovered something profound: freedom. I could move through the rooms without fear, without calculation, without the constant mental negotiation I had endured for weeks. My life, though temporarily intertwined with his, was anchored firmly by my own choices and clarity. The final confrontation at Sauron's office solidified the outcome. Evander's attempts to challenge the trust legally were systematically dismantled. Every argument he made, every loophole he had hoped to exploit, crumbled under scrutiny. Sauron's calm authority was unshakable, and I watched as Evander's confidence eroded. The settlement was fair, precise, and unequivocal. Half of marital assets, which amounted to a modest sum reflecting the short duration of our marriage. No claim to the trust, no alimony, and legal fees accounted for. Leaving the office, I felt an unexpected lightness. For the first time in weeks, the world seemed larger, brighter, freer. I didn't gloat. I didn't feel the need to exact revenge. Instead, I felt a quiet satisfaction rooted in justice, clarity, and the preservation of what was rightfully mine. Evander, meanwhile, was left to reconcile his actions with their consequences, socially, legally, and personally. The social ramifications unfolded swiftly. Charleston's professional and social circles took note of the circumstances. Evander's reputation, once solid and enviable, showed cracks. Clients and acquaintances began to distance themselves, wary of association with someone whose marriage had unraveled so publicly over greed and manipulation. Friends and colleagues who had supported him quietly reevaluated their alliances. And I moved through it all with a quiet dignity, unshaken, grounded, and aware of my own integrity. In the weeks that followed, I took deliberate steps to reclaim my personal space and professional identity. The home felt different, lighter, no longer a stage for negotiation or coercion. I returned to my routines, immersed myself in meaningful work, and allowed myself to nurture friendships untainted by hidden agendas or manipulations. Every small act, cooking, reading, walking through the city streets, was infused with a sense of empowerment I hadn't fully recognized before. And then came the moment of final closure. Evander moved out, taking with him the tension and the constant reminders of the past weeks. He left quietly, with no dramatic confrontations, no final words, just the acknowledgement. tacit or otherwise, that the battle had been lost. I watched him leave, not with anger, but with calm observation, fully aware of the pattern that had defined our relationship. That evening, I sat on the porch, Charleston's gentle evening breeze brushing my face, the city's lights twinkling like distant stars. I reflected on the past months, the pressure, the manipulation, the ultimatums, the betrayal, and, most importantly, my response. I had been tested, pushed to emotional extremes, and yet I had emerged unbroken. The fallout, though chaotic and socially intense, had solidified my understanding of my own strength and boundaries. I knew that Evander, his family, and their allies would carry the consequences of their actions. Reputation, credibility, and relationships had shifted irreversibly. And I, having acted with clarity, fairness, and unwavering principle, had reclaimed my life, not through vengeance, but through steadfast commitment to what I knew was right. The morning after Evander moved out, the house felt like a space reclaimed by light and calm. The air no longer carried the tension of coercion or manipulation. It carried freedom. I walked through each room slowly, touching the familiar surfaces, letting myself feel the reality. I had survived, I had endured, and I had protected what mattered most. In the weeks that followed, I found myself rediscovering the rhythm of my own life. I focused on work, immersed myself in projects that mattered, and surrounded myself with people who valued honesty, integrity, and mutual respect. The lessons of the past months were clear. True partnership isn't about leverage, control, or access to assets. It's about trust, shared values, and unwavering respect. I also reflected deeply on personal boundaries. I realized that saying no, holding firm to principles, and refusing to be manipulated was not a weakness, it was strength. The strength to protect oneself, to honor family legacy, and to recognize when love is conditional rather than unconditional. I had learned to differentiate between genuine affection and opportunistic interest, and that clarity was empowering. There was also an unexpected gift in all of this: self-awareness. I now knew the kind of life I wanted, the kind of partner I deserved, and the values I would never compromise. I felt a renewed confidence, a grounded sense of self, and a recognition that my worth was never determined by someone else's entitlement. As I stepped onto the porch one evening, Charleston's skyline glowing softly in the distance, I breathed deeply, letting the breeze wash over me. The storm had passed, but its lessons remained. I had emerged stronger, wiser, and more resolute than ever. My life was mine to shape, guided by principle, self-respect, and the knowledge that I could face any challenge without surrendering my integrity. And for anyone watching, anyone navigating relationships entangled with power, money, or manipulation, remember this: your worth is not negotiable, your boundaries are sacred, and strength often comes in calm clarity, not in loud confrontation. Protect your peace, honor your values, and let life unfold around the integrity you hold. I closed my eyes, a quiet smile forming, feeling reborn. The inheritance wasn't mine to live for, it was mine to steward. And my life, that, finally, was mine to live fully, fiercely, and without compromise.